last week we had, or actually it was 2 weeks ago, we had finished Pilate's questioning of Jesus in chapter 27, verses 11 through 14. So we'll go on with the crowd selecting Barabbas instead of Jesus and Pilate washing his hands, which we may or may not get to, but we'll read all of it this evening. So it's chapter 27, verses 15 through 26. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much over him today in a dream." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the people to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this righteous man's blood. See to it yourselves." And all the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. So there's a good deal of debate, especially among contemporary interpreters, about the historical validity or reliability of this verse. First of all, at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted, is actually a practice that is unknown. The only mention of it is in the Gospels, actually in Mark, John, and Matthew, and it's implied in Luke. But on the other hand, it's not inconceivable. So it was fairly common, particularly around the time of festivals, to release prisoners to gain popular support. Josephus also documents basically one-off amnesties by Archelaus, who was the Seleucid king, and by Albinus, who was the governor of Syria, and so the prefect of Palestine would have been answerable to the governor of Jerusalem. It's also the kind of, given Pilate's lack of popularity, the kind of thing that he might be likely to do. And in that case, its effectiveness would depend on people having the right to select their own released prisoner rather than the prefect forcing one upon them. So there's a good basis for assuming that although this wasn't a regular practice, it actually happened. What's interesting here that in the original, in the earlier, or in many of the earliest manuscripts, Barabbas is given a first name. It's Jesus or Yeshua. So Jesus and Barabbas have the same first name. And does anyone know what Barabbas means?
Criminal.
No.
I don't know.
Bar?
I don't know.
Simon Bar Jonah? Barabbas? The bar means son of. So Abbas, Abba. What is Abba?
Father.
Father.
Yeah.
So Barabbas is Jesus, son of the Father.
Wow.
So the irony here is that, so we've been talking about irony throughout this section of Matthew's gospel. So the irony is the crowd is given a choice between Jesus, who someone named Jesus, someone named Jesus who is named the Son of the Father, as opposed to Jesus who is the Son of the Father. And they choose the wrong one. They choose the one who is only named Son of the Father instead of the one who really is Son of the Father. Then typically in the later manuscripts that Jesus is not mentioned as the first name of Barabbas. So there's an irony also in the fact that Pilate's concern is with preserving order, right? And he's in Jerusalem for the festival precisely to deal with, you know, the possibility of an unruly crowd or a revolt or riots or violence. So his role is to maintain order, since order in the empire was, you know, really a high priority. And so the irony is that he releases a violent political threat in place of, instead of Jesus, who is not a violent political threat.
Yeah.
So his action is, you know, given his role and given his responsibilities, really a complete abrogation of responsibility. So why does he do that?
Popularity is more important.
Yeah, I think popularity is more important. Or even, in some sense, less popularity than, you know, sort of evaluating which one is the greater threat. Is Barabbas the greater threat, or are the people clamoring for Barabbas, if they don't get their way, the greater threat?
Mhm.
Remember, Matthew says that that Pilate sees that it's out of envy that they're rejecting Jesus. In verse 18, for he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up.
Yeah, when I think of the crowd being envious, I think it's the high priests were envious.
Yeah.
Right, here it's, yeah.
And the high priests were encouraging the crowd.
Mm-hmm. In verse 20, it says, now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the people to ask for Barabbas and destroyed Jesus. So the hand of the Sanhedrin is behind the entire procedure. We have really three groups. We have the crowd, we have the Sanhedrin, and we have Pilate. So to what extent do they bear responsibility, and what is Matthew saying? And what's most striking in terms of the crowd is that in verse 25, Matthew drops the word crowd and begins to speak about all the people.
Mhm.
And the word he uses there typically is used to refer to the community of Israel as God's chosen people. So, since a major theme of this section of Matthew's gospel is who is responsible, who is responsible?
You mean as the group, like the Jews, or are you talking about the Sanhedrin and Pilate and the people?
The Sanhedrin, the people, Pilate, who
Yeah.
bears responsibility?
Well, I thought we just decided that we discussed that all three of them bear responsibility. But
Mhm.
you're saying there's one group in particular?
No, I'm not saying one group in particular. All three do, in fact, bear responsibility. So for the Sanhedrin, it's obvious that they are the movers of the entire procedure. That that they've given Judas the money. Um, at the same time, when he returned it, they've refused to, recognize their own role. But they've nevertheless continued on to persecute and to try to destroy Jesus. They've looked for false witnesses and accidentally found two truthful witnesses. They've then um, they've satisfied themselves that Jesus was blaspheming, but then they've really twisted the charges a bit in presenting the charges before Pilate, since Pilate wouldn't be at all interested in blasphemy. And they've also influenced the crowd to turn against Jesus. So they're very clearly guilty.
I see them as the puppet masters.
Yeah. Mhm.
Mm-hmm. They're the puppet masters of the crowd, but not really of Pilate.
No.
Pilate and they really have, in many ways, um, in some sense, I guess, a love-hate relationship, or also an antithetical relationship. So Caiaphas, given that he's been is and remains high priest for a comparatively long time, and then following him, the high priest changes almost yearly, is obviously a political opportunist and a political manipulator. And at the same time, he persists by walking the tightrope and not thoroughly alienating the Romans, is also not exactly well disposed toward the Romans. So it's a difficult act. So Pilate is supposed to be the governor, His responsibility is to maintain order. And he releases a dangerous prisoner. And we discussed that Barabbas isn't simply a murderer or a criminal. He's a social bandit. From the viewpoint of the Romans, a revolutionary. And, releasing someone like that is certainly not a good thing to do when your concern is with order. We talked about Matthew using the term governor, ironically, because Pilate isn't doing a very good job as governor, and he is also as someone who hears capital cases. His responsibility is also to acquit the innocents and convict the guilty, and he fails to do that completely. What is the significance of his wife's dream? Does anyone have thoughts about that?
Well, she calls him a holy man. So there seemed to have been some importance in the way she said that to him, not to get involved with that because something can come back to you. No?
Mm-hmm. A holy or righteous man,
Right. So, she didn't see the guilt in him.
dikaios, it's the same word used two other times in Matthew's gospel. It's used of Joseph. He was a righteous man when he decided not to expose his wife as an adulteress, not to expose Mary as an adulteress. And it's used when Jesus tells John the Baptist that John should go ahead with the baptism in order to fulfill all righteousness. He's described by her as a righteous man. It comes to her in a dream. And remember that dreams in the earlier part of St. Matthew's gospel were very important, right? So first of all, in a dream, Joseph is told to take Mary as his wife rather than shaming and humiliating her. The Magi, that in chapter 1, verse 20. In chapter 2, verse 12, the Magi are told not to return to Herod in a dream, but simply to go back to, where were they from? Persia. And then in a dream, Joseph is told to flee to Egypt. And finally, Joseph is told to settle in Galilee rather than to settle in Judea, since Herod the Great was still alive. So dreams are a means by which God communicates his will. God communicates his will to Pilate's wife. Pilate's wife communicates the dream and therefore communicates God's will to Pilate.
Mm-hmm.
And what does he do?
Ignores it.
Ignores it. So Pilate is ultimately very guilty. He's completely. I mean, there's been a tendency, to accept his washing of hands as washing of hands, and so he's not responsible. But in fact, he's very responsible. He's completely failed in his role as governor. He could have stopped. He was even given the information he needed, and he knew that the charges were trumped and they were doing it out of envy. envy may not be, the way we would look at it or the way the Sanhedrin did, but certainly hostility and injustice, and he failed to stop the proceeding. What about the crowd and Matthew's use of all the people?
Well, I think the crowd is probably used to following the guidance of their high priest, because in their own communities, that's a person that you revere and you want to follow what they're saying. So when they have a group of high priests telling them what to do, that crowd mentality, oh, we better
Mm-hmm.
do what they say.
And we've talked about the crowd earlier. So remember, this is the festival. I mean, this is the Passover. So Jerusalem is filled with pilgrims. The pilgrims are going to focus on the temple area. So they're probably not going to be in the neighborhood of Pilate and the Praetorium. And later, when Jesus is mocked by the crowd, they're not going to be outside of the city watching people carrying the cross to Golgotha. So that's not something, watching a nice execution is probably not something a pilgrim coming to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration, which is next to the Day of Atonement, the most holy time of the year, is going to do. So earlier, remember, Jesus really pits or depicts Jerusalem as a whole as in conflict with the coming of the Messiah. And so it starts in chapter 2, verse 3. So when the Magi come, verse 2, they ask, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. So Jerusalem is troubled by the Magi asking, "Where is the Messiah?" Then remember, all of Jesus' ministry then occurs in Galilee or north of Galilee until he makes his northward swing and then comes back down and approaches Jerusalem through Jericho. And then in chapter 21, verse 10, it says, "And when he had entered Jerusalem," so there's the ceremony as Jesus is approaching Jerusalem. And so these are pilgrims who are also going to Jerusalem for the Passover. And and so they're hailing Jesus, and in verse 9 say, "Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest." And then there's a contrast with that in verse 10, "And when he entered Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, 'Who is this?' And the crowd said, 'This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee.'" But the implication is that the "who is this" is really kind of a hostile question or an unbelieving question.
Mhm.
For the crowd, it's a question around Jesus. It's a question that needs no answer. For the inhabitants of Jerusalem, it's likely to be one that's met with incredulity. So this crowd is a very selective one that's tied to Jerusalem and is tied to the religious establishment. But then why does Matthew change from describing them as a crowd to describing them as all the people? And then also to say, his blood be upon us and our children.
Would you ask your question again?
Well, instead of simply a crowd,
No, yeah.
the word is laos, which in Greek in the Septuagint is associated with the community of Israel as God's chosen people. So Matthew has switched from crowd to all the people. So what does that mean, and why has he done that?
Because all of those people that were present were Jews,
From Jerusalem.
rather than a mixture of just people. Was specific.
Well, I mean, the people hailing Jesus as he entered Jerusalem were also all Jews.
Right, but they weren't living in the city.
Right, but they weren't living in
So,
the city.
so it was those people that was in the city, thus made up most of the crowd, because those people outside couldn't get in.
But he switched to use from crowd to be using a word that is associated with the entire community of Israelites as God's people. So why has he done that? The unfortunately in much of Christian history, the answer is that this was a permanent curse upon the Jews for
Yeah,
killing Jesus.
yeah, that's a really tough statement, when they talk about not the crowd but the people, and then that quotation there, let his blood be on us and our children, so on and so forth. It's like that nail that closed there,
Right.
that nailed them in to this bad thing.
So it's been interpreted as a permanent curse throughout all the generations. So all Jews are cursed because they've they're all guilty of murder of Jesus.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. Yeah.
But is that what Matthew is saying or means?
Well, the way it's written, it seems that's what he means. No?
Um, no, I would argue not.
No? Okay. What do you think?
Well, so two things.
Mm-hmm.
One, how do God's promises flow? And two, what does Matthew in the prophets? And two, what does Matthew say about contact with the Gentiles? So the first question, how do God's promises flow? So what happens in periods of idolatry and great apostasy?
Wrath comes down on them.
Yeah.
Wrath, judgment, but what happens?
And
Where
then
do
they're
God's,
forgiven.
what?
And then later they're forgiven and he restores them, like he restored them to their land. He
But
promised
who is restored? Because there's enormous destruction and devastation in the wrath.
the 12 tribes.
many of the tribes are also destroyed. So who reaps the benefits of God's promises? The prophets usually use one word to describe them.
Chosen.
No, that's a little broad. Remnant.
Oh,
God's promises flow through a remnant. So those who remain faithful, the remnant. So who's the remnant here?
those not there.
Yeah,
They're
those not in the
not
crowd. Yeah,
included.
Where are they?
outside.
Now they've run away, but they'll be back.
Mm,
They're the people who, particularly the 12 disciples, 11 now, given that Judas is dead, they've abandoned Jesus for the moment, but they'll regain their faith.
When he's resurrected.
Yeah, the women who continue to be faithful and don't abandon him,
mhm.
and the other followers of Jesus at this point. So they're the remnant through whom God's promises flow because they're faithful. So then, looking back, what about contact with what does Matthew say about relations with the Gentiles?
Well, having Jesus do most of his ministry up north would tell you that he probably felt the Gentiles were more receptive to the message.
Where have they been receptive? And how has he responded?
So they've been following him, listening to his messages. They've been believing in his miracles,
Miracle.
not taking them as tricks, but having belief in them. Instance after instance of people being cured, whatever, because of their faith. And when those things happen, he responds by helping them however he can, with the food, with healings.
So the feeding of the 4,000 was probably occurred before a predominantly Gentile audience.
Mm,
Um, so, but there's very little, sort of, I mean, it's symbolically a significant event, but Matthew doesn't comment on it in a way that is particularly prophetic. I mean, we know it's prophetic simply because it's an enactment of something and it doesn't enact anything in the old covenant, whereas the feeding of the 5,000 does. It both points backward and forward, whereas feeding of the 4,000 only points forward. But what else where a comment is made about the relationship of Gentiles and Jews? How about the Roman centurion in chapter 8?
The one who wanted his servant healed,
I'm sorry, what, Mary?
the one who wanted his servant healed,
Right,
and because of his faith, he was.
And then how did Jesus respond other than healing the servant?
I don't remember.
Chapter 8, verse 10.
So he marveled at their faith.
Yeah, let's look at verses 10 through 12.
Mm-hmm.
When Jesus heard him, he marveled and said to those who followed him, "Truly I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and sit at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. Their men will weep and gnash their teeth."
So that's the Israelites.
Right, so that's the Israelites. So the kingdom of heaven will be composed of a combination of the Israelites and non-Israelites. What else?
What else about God's promises, or what else about the Gentiles?
The Gentiles.
Well, they aren't as apt to be following whatever the Sanhedrin say because they aren't of that faith.
Right.
A little more freedom to develop their own faith.
How about the parable of the vineyard?
The good plants and the bad plants.
The the bad tenants.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at it. Chapter 21, verse 45.
They were the bad tenants.
Yeah. Chapter 21, verse 43. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you. So his conflict here is with the chief priests and elders of the people. So these are the same people who are responsible for his crucifixion, or for handing him over to Pilate, who then in turn is responsible for his crucifixion. And so in after telling the parable, he says, therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a nation producing the fruits of it. And he who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces. When it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Anything else? Another even earlier is the Magi. It's so the Magi had seen the star in the east, and it had led them to Jerusalem.
But those in Jerusalem hadn't seen it or didn't recognize its significance.
Right. The implication, so these are the Magi are fortune tellers. They're, if we move them into our contemporary world, we would call them new agey, right? Definitely not good, not something to be, looked at with favor. Practitioners of the black arts, we might say. And yet they see the signs when the people of God, don't see the signs. So that makes a statement about the relationship with the Gentiles. And then we also have the Canaanite woman in chapter 15. And remember, here Jesus is very, very hard on Canaanite woman. Jesus says in verse 26, it is not fair to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And we had talked about this within its context, that Matthew is contrasting the reaction of the Canaanite woman to opposition with the reaction of the Jewish religious establishment to opposition. So they don't like what Jesus is saying, and they simply reject it outright. In contrast to that, the Canaanite woman is insulted, and yet she has love for her daughter. She has a need to see her daughter healed, and she believes that Jesus is capable of doing that. So whether she's insulted or not, whether she likes it or not, she's going to press closer. She's not going to behave in the way that the religious establishment does. And so as a Gentile, her daughter receives healing. So we have the remnant and we have the Gentiles. And so what does that say about all the people? And who is it that is cursed in ourselves and our children? How can we put those all together?
So the remnant and the Gentiles wouldn't be part of that group because they're not part of the group trying to crucify Jesus either.
Right.
They
Right.
have faith in him. They
So,
believe
right,
him, believe
right.
who he is. So all the people are the same people that all along have been giving him, challenging him, trying to get him, trick him, trying to find ways of condemning him. And those that go along with the religious establishment that's doing it. So like people in the crowd would be, so when he's saying all the people, he means everybody who's not part of the remnant or the Gentile.
Mm-hmm. So what is he talking about?
All the people have been given chances over and over and over and have proved that they don't have faith.
He's talking about really an eschatological event, the transition to a new stage in the divine economy where promises no longer flow exclusively through God's people, through the Israelites as God's people, but instead a remnant from those Israelites who are God's people, touch the Gentiles and form the church, which inherits the promises of Israel and the Israelites.
So the remnants includes Jews, right?
The remnant, the remnant
Are Jews.
are Jews.
Are Jews. Okay.
Are
Okay.
Jews, right? The remnant are
The
basically
remnants of the general
the
of all the
remnants of
the
right.
nation.
The remnants are Jews. The
I
remnants
get
are
it.
only Jews.
Yeah. Okay. Well, don't we call them Christians now? I mean,
Yeah, but the term took a while to form
to change, to form. Yeah.
and originally in in the early church, um, basically um, followers of Christ were really a sect within Judaism.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
that remained true for quite some time.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
they incorporated Gentiles, but they also separately practiced the Eucharist but they remain part of Judaism, and that unity with Judaism sort of gradually simply broke apart. Um, so remember in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew said that, truly I say to you in verse 20, chapter 24, verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And earlier he says something like, in verse 27 of chapter 16, he says, for the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father. And then he will repay every man for what he has done. Truly, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So he's speaking of an eschatological event that will occur sometime within the lifetimes of some of those who he's speaking to. And in the Olivet Discourse, he's saying that this generation will not pass away. So at any given time, there are two generations alive, right? There's usually, in fact, more than that, typically, often three, sometimes more, but most particularly, we have the actors and their children. Most of them, or many of the children of the actors, will already have been born. Those are a second generation. So we have involved here two generations. Jesus died, is crucified roughly in 30 or 33. Either 37 or 40 years later, the temple falls. Many of the people who are part of the religious establishment at the time of the death of Jesus are still going to be alive, but not all that many, given that that's a fairly long period of time, even taking 40 years as a generation, giving limited lifespans. Some of that that current generation will still be alive, but not many. But many of their children will be alive. And so this, all the people, and a curse being on all the people, refers to the end of temple Judaism. It's that's cursed. And the Jewish religious establishment that supports temple Judaism, which is both cursed and with the destruction of the temple, is completely destroyed. So Matthew is talking about a change, a dramatic eschatological change in the divine economy. So there's contrast really sharply with the evangelical fundamentalist and premillennial dispensationalist view that God's promises revert to Israel, that the temple will have to be rebuilt, that animal sacrifices will have to be resumed, which is a central part of evangelical so-called prophecy. So with that, we should stop. So for next week, there's still a bit more to discuss here. We probably want to discuss washing one's hands a little bit, since that's interesting. The accusation is made that that probably couldn't have happened because it was a Jewish practice, and what's his name, Pilate, was not a Jew, so he wouldn't have done it. And then we'll discuss the mocking of Jesus.